One quote about what PTSD can do, several things. Limits their ability to function effectively, limits their ability to take advantage of resources or services, and limits their ability to ever exit the life. Yet another obstacle keeping them in captivity. Now this is another list of living hell. And this was actually a study done that surveyed survivors of sex trafficking and how many of them were exhibiting these various PTSD symptoms. The list actually goes on. I cut it off at 52 because most of them are experiencing these symptoms. Then there's also trauma bonding. So there's the effects of trauma, could be PTSD, as well as trauma bonding, which looks at just extreme gratitude over smallest acts of kindness and mercy by the exploiter. There was one survey of a homeless girl in New York who was sold. They were asking her maybe some highlights or some things that weren't so horrific during her captivity. Anyway, needless to say, the standards of what is considered human acts of kindness is very, very low. Also, of course, denying whether or not they're being exploited, or whether they're suffering, or whether they're trapped, whether they're injured. Rooting for their exploiter to actually have an improved status in life, standard in life. Hypervigilance, term of his needs, being much more concerned about his needs or circumstances than their own. And, which is very telling, suggesting that he is actually harming her, or suggesting that he is not, the knight in shining armor, can often prompt a defensiveness. Unfortunately, or tragically, in that same West Coast Children's Clinic study, the kids that they were surveying that had been sold, less than half of them knew that their exploiter did not have their best interests at heart. We've got this handout in the back, actually comes from Polaris Project, so it took the power and control wheel that is in wide distribution in terms of domestic violence, intimate violence victims, and added several other segments in terms of how this trauma bonding can occur. And then this is a piece of evidence that was actually used to convict a trafficker, in terms of how he had literally written out the rules to the game to help keep him on track of keeping his victims under control and extenuating this trauma bonding scenario, or Stockholm Syndrome. I just wrote a few of them out, rather than all 10. Make them depend on you, power is control. Make them always feel insecure. Don't let them get away with no sneaking. Make sure that you own them mind, body, and soul, and check it out. For example, having someone pose as a John and offer to help and see how she responds. And the last one, always try to know what's going on, and if there are several girls who are being exploited, have them tell on each other. To continue to make them rely on the exploiter, but also have this perpetuate this atmosphere and now this culture of paranoia. Now, the main reason I'm presenting some of this, hopefully most of it pretty accurate, is that not addressing this trauma and the symptoms of trauma and the symptoms of trauma bonding and PTSD can lead to several terrible things. Number one, of course, is for the victim not to engage in services at all, or if she's already engaged in services, to disengage. It also makes even if they stay receiving services and counseling, that it becomes harder to manage their case. There's also the re-traumatization risk, increase in their symptoms, increase in the relapse, which is to be anticipated, but hopefully minimized, and overall poor treatment outcomes. The other very, very real scenario about being conscious of approaching a victim in the scenario is a very real threat, of course, to their lives. And perhaps a brief suggestion that she should get out that's left without a plan or resources or a contact can be fatal. So for example, this was a pimp who was recently convicted and sentenced to life for shooting a girl he'd been exploiting in the face when she said she didn't want to do it anymore and she was going home. March 21st, he was sentenced to 40 years to life, and his last statement through his attorney was he doesn't know who killed her, but he always treated her nicely. Now, the good news is, and what I loved in the West Coast Children's Clinic study that they published about needs and strengths, is not to pathologize someone who has been victimized, but to identify the fact that not only are they people, but they are people with their own strengths as well as their needs. And these were several strengths that stood out that existed in these survivors. A high degree of cultural identity, creativity, their peer relationship capabilities were high, their spirituality was high, their leadership scores were high, and so were their resiliencies. So we do not, I love that phrase, I should have memorized it, but I could only memorize so many things, and I thought the shark, rattlesnake deal was So we don't want to pathologize them, just like they're our own kids, or you know and love, or you have been through this. You know that they are beautiful, wonderful, capable, strong, talented, ingenious beauties that just need help getting that out from the darkness and the lies that their entire life experience, both what they've heard and what has been done to them physically, has been heaped on them. So in getting to some more aspects in terms of leveraging those strengths and hopefully providing some input, even as a non-professional, that will be more helpful than not. This is the Cartman drama triangle, not necessarily drama as in drama queen, but drama as in roles or performances that can be assumed by those who have been victimized, or even me. I go through this all the time as well. And then Ted, whoever Power of Ted is, he added a little bit more to this. So the point is that anyone who has been victimized, but certainly those who have been severely victimized at a young age, they actually will go through this triangle, shifting different roles in the process on how they interact to other people. So, obvious one is being a victim, because of course they were, and they're still victimized by the symptoms of the trauma that they had endured. So their safety net in this scenario is that love me because I am so helpless. Serve me because I am so helpless. Now, according to Ted and others, an antidote to that particular role is to actually encourage them to tap into their creativity and ingenuity to be an innovator about the challenges that they have and make it more like something that can be exciting and something that can be overcome through their own ingenuity, their own innovation, and their own creativity. Another role is the rescuer, and the safety role there is that love me for what I do. So I'm serving, I'm helping, I'm reaching out to others, I'm doing good deeds, and the safety valve there is what I'm doing for others. The antidote would be to encourage them to be a coach, not to fix other people, but to encourage and support them in what they are trying to achieve. The last one is the persecutor, who is always right. The safety role there is I'm in control. If I am directing or oppressing or being aggressive or hostile towards others, I'm in control and I can't be hurt that way. An antidote is actually to be a challenger, which is also kind of an inspiring and activating and being a cheerleader for others. But knowing that these cycles will actually help, because all of us, I do all these all the time, you have a better knowledge of how to address someone's situation in that moment of time if you realize what role they're actually acting out. In terms of best practices, as near as I can tell, on sex trafficking, exit, and recovery, this will actually look redundant, but it's something that all of us know. Supportive relationships are a key factor, and they need to be consistent over time. They need to be non-judgmental. You need to have significant perseverance, and it will take considerable time and repeated contacts. So we kind of get this consistency, repeated time, in it for the long haul, in it for them, non-judgmental, their timetable, their pace. Because the bottom line is, in terms of the mental health consequences of the trauma that they've endured, is their basic life assumptions have been destroyed in terms of whether anyone is safe from harm, particularly them, whether in fact they're actually a good and decent person, and whether there's any point to the world, whether there's any hope in expecting or believing that the world is meaningful and just. In terms of trauma stabilization, this was very, at least to me, enlightening. And this goes back to the feeling flashback phenomenon that we suggested or reviewed before. Is that these anxiety and panic systems, these helplessness and this terror, can occur by what we would consider a relatively benign event. And, for example, being alone in a room at twilight, or I know a wonderful survivor that she could be in a restaurant, and if they were playing 80s music, that would bring her to a point of terror, because that's what her exploiter played in the trailer where he sold her. Obviously, you would have no idea, and you may overreact and say, oh, I must have done something wrong, or I should find someone else. So being cognizant of not only how these triggers, these feeling flashbacks occur, is obviously important, but also to realize that these trauma memories are encoded in terms of their senses and their feelings. So they're not necessarily visual flashbacks, so you can't necessarily, where are you, and let's talk through that. So it's just a general, inexplicable, don't know where it came from, and don't know why it happened, but I am absolutely terrified, and I will respond. If she could, remember the trauma, and actually not have this generalized, and because there's so much complex trauma, it may not be a single incident. It may be the compounding effect of so many. But if she could, she would be able to put the things together and realize that these aren't random, that it's not likely to happen at any time, and that this is another form of helpless victimization, that these overwhelming terror and panic feelings are something that she will have to experience for the rest of her life. So in the stabilization process, part of it is to walk through and say, listen, the reason why you are feeling this way is because you have experienced so much. But the very fact that we are having this conversation means that you have it within yourself to be able to persevere. That in fact your terror demonstrates your ability to survive and to thrive. If you could help them with their narrative and to connect the dots of where these trigger, not only this explains why you're so terrified, but also to recognize that when you were actually in those immediate danger scenarios as a kid, you still made it. And not only barely scraped by, but there were very exact specific things that were commendable, admirable, high achievements, high accomplishments. that it wasn't just surviving, to connect those dots of not only the abuse, but also the highlights, empowering her through her own experiences of surviving. If you can go through this process, or a skilled professional takes them through the process, not only does it make sense of what's going on, but it also makes them realize that they're normal, that anyone that had endured a traumatic incident will experience these feeling flashbacks, especially if there are circumstances that are familiar to what occurred. And at this point, they will respond. All of us will respond to overwhelming feelings of hopelessness and terror. And it's an opportunity not only to talk through where they came from, why they're occurring, that they are normal, and that there is a history not only of surviving but doing well. What are you going to do now based on the situation? And of those options, what is going to actually be most effective? The last time you had these feelings and you did X, was that effective, or would you rather try Y? So, I built together my very own distress response steps, or I had an acronym, but I forgot. Okay, but it'll all be S's. Stabilize. So when they are experiencing this overwhelming panic and sense of being completely out of control and this imminent danger, to say, hold it. You are actually in a safe place. There is no one posing an immediate threat to you. There's no one here with a gun. There's no one here screaming at you. There is no one here threatening you. Grounding techniques, literally feet on the ground, holding a tennis ball or an ice cube, to be brought to the present reality that immediate danger, bodily harm threats are not literally occurring. And then to see, to stabilize, and then to see. As we discussed, to see that their feelings, although they're very real, are not necessarily related to the current circumstances. And that if they got through those circumstances before, they have what it takes to get through them in the future. And that the fact that they are actually feeling this proves